Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists absolutely got it correct. And this is Tom Navolis, your host. One of the concepts that I want to bring out today is how predictive, again, those Anti-Federalists really were. They had the insights only because they really looked at the depths of humanity. And many of them still had that deep biblical perspective on life and understanding of mankind as sinful creatures. So they were able to assess exceptionally well into the depths of history and their history, into ancient history, because they studied ancient history very, very clearly, and it was a common study. It wasn't just for the academics. No, it was for all of those youth that were in education, that were learning what life was about. It was critical to know your past in so many different ways. Now, what I want to talk about today is something that is affecting us very much and has been affecting us for the whole time that the U.S. has been in existence, that being foreign affairs or foreign influences. I'm going to take a twist into the second segment a bit on those foreign influences. And those of you that are in the various markets that only get segment 1 and segment 3, I highly recommend that you go ahead to samueladamsreturns.net and listen to segment 2 as you can, either at the website there where you can download the podcast, or the links to the videos at the two different places that they are presented to you. The importance of this to understand is in that the foreign influences are not just in the lobbyists, they're not just in foreign governments, but actually what we'll talk about in the second segment is in high tech. And that the founders intended, and Samuel Adams in particular, would bring out that anybody that came to this nation needed to become Americans. They needed to understand our culture as Americans. They needed to be inculcated in the common beliefs of America. Was that to have them all convert to Christianity? No. But the foundational principles of biblical Reformation thought that was in the workings, the culture, the political ideas of America, obviously, through watching this program or listening to this program, have a very strong Christian source and influence. So what about these foreign influences? What's happened with them? And how do we take and look at that today? How do we address it? Because as you well know, we have foreign influences all the way down into the local community level. It's very, very interesting, but I'm not going to get to that level of detail in this program. By far, there's no time or that the ability to do that. In fact, when it even comes to technology, in the second segment, I'm not going to get to the list of details of foreign actors in that regard, because I think that, not that I think, I know the depth of that I have not had the time to really put together from all the research in any concise manner for you. But I'm going to give you some highlights. So when I take and I look here that the major concerns of the Anti-Federalist at the time of the ratification was definitely from that foreign trade perspective. That was one key area. And with the foreign trade, there's always levels of influence that come along with that. Well, those influences are not only from a direct political influence, but how is it then that when we differentiate between the mercantile mechanisms being commerce, who is associated with that, how does banking work, how is that international influence in loans as well as in domestic affairs, what goes on. And quite frankly, the Anti-Federalists were very concerned about that. They had the insights. What were they? Well, fundamentally, those insights were common amongst all mankind. Lust, envy, greed, power, how to control the people, how to control the ideas. All of that the Anti-Federalists were concerned about. We hear so many moderns that argue against the Constitution saying, well, they had no idea about what we deal with right now. I totally dispute that. We may not see a detail of what are bits and bytes, artificial intelligence, some of the other extremely new technologies. But the fundamental concepts of humanity are exactly the same. All humans, in so many ways, start out from that basics of being a sinful person. So there's a commonality across all that we want to do, what we would want to do to our fellow man. And if you are a believer in Christ, then your faith carries you forward, and then you take and you have a whole different perspective as to how we interact within humanity. So this week is a comparative review on the arguments of the founding era to the present destructions of the citizen's sovereignty by a political class corrupted through foreign affairs and entanglements. Can we take and look and consider the likes of Mitch McConnell with that, considering that his wife, Miss Chow, Chow McConnell, I guess is how you would say it, her father is still a part of the Communist Party, highly involved in businesses in the Communist China. Oh, wait a minute. No, was he from Shanghai or Hong Kong or one of all of that? It doesn't matter. He is still highly involved in what goes on there. And the influence mechanisms that are involved in that are extremely interesting. And there's others, many, many others. When you take it to the state level, how tied is California? How tied are other states to other foreign interests that are there because they hold businesses, have commerce going on in their state? How is it that we're allowing the Chinese to buy so much property here in the United States? Well, that happened. Japan would buy a lot of high-rises way back in, the 80s, and we look at that. Who knows where those are right now and all those different properties. But the fact of the matter is that we're having those types of influences because, remember, when you own property, you have major influence. That was something that the founders always said. That was one of the key elements that they were talking about. And I want to take you and bring to you this interesting point by a farmer. This is an example that I have here in the program promo or in the blog post that goes along with the program at samueladamsreturns.net. He wrote, "There are but two modes by which men are connected in society, the one which operates on individuals. This always has been, and ought still to be called, national government. The other which binds states and governments together, not corporations, for there is no considerable nation on earth, despotic, monarchical, or republican, that does not contain many subordinate corporations with various constitutions. This last has heretofore been denominated a league or confederacy. The term Federalist is therefore improperly applied to themselves by the friends and supporters of the proposed Constitution. This abuse of language does not help the cause. Every degree of imposition serves only to irritate, but can never convince. They are national men, and their opponents, or at least a great majority of them, are federal, in the only true and strict sense of the word. I wanted to bring to you that definition that those people that called themselves Federalist stole the word and manipulated the meaning. No different than is what's happening in our present time in the way that language is manipulated and used and stolen to promote a cause. And as he says here, it only serves to irritate. So what the Federalists, those that called them the Federalists, really were was about a consolidated government to take and bring together and form that type of nation that we are seeing today, where the states are subsumed by the federal government in so many different ways. I want to bring you to another point here. In the first comments on the Foreign Affairs by a farmer is in March 7, 1788. And here's what he was writing. That a national government will add to the dignity and increase the splendor of the United States abroad can admit of no doubt. It is essentially requisite for both. That it is required in order to keep us at peace among ourselves is doubtful. Now, this is very important because what we're seeing is ourselves being torn apart right now. Okay? So whether that national government can keep us with peace amongst ourselves. That it is necessary to prevent foreigners from dividing us or interfering in our government, I deny positively. And after all, I have strong doubts whether all its advantages are not more specious than solid. We are vain like other nations. We wish to make a noise in the world and feel hurt that Europeans are not so attentive to America in peace as they were to America in war. We are also, no doubt, desirous of cutting a figure in history. Should we not reflect that quiet is happiness, that content and pomp are incompatible? I have either read or heard this truth, which the Americans should never forget, that the silence of historians is the sure record of the happiness of the people. He continues on with this. Well, let me dissect this for a minute, and then we'll have to pick the next section up in the next segment as we move to that. So where he's going with this is that he's seeing that if we're quiet and we don't get involved also in the European affairs, the Europeans are not attentive to us as they were in war. Well, you see that throughout even modern history. How was it that the nations looked at America when they were involved in numerous different things as the policemen of the world, or the great country, the great breadbasket, on and on, where America was looked at positively. But there was a time when we were not. And we're not again. And the reasons we're not again is because we're not prosperous and we just make all these crazy noises out there that come from the administration and such. So when we're really thinking about what is it necessary to take and be an internalized nation, but yet still have a presence in the world, we can do that through commerce in such interesting ways without having that influence of the other nations within us. But one of the key elements here in these last few seconds is that to prevent foreigners from dividing us or interfering in our government, he denies it positively. And that's where he says here is that whether its advantages are not more specious than solid. Come on back in the next segment as we pick this up, because Sam Adams and the Anti-Federalist absolutely did get it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists did get it right. I want to pick up where I left off in the quote from a farmer as that was being written. And as we finished off talking about some of the influence that was there, I want to continue with the quote before we get into the technology side of the equation of foreign influence and how that has operated, and actually how it's brought us to the point that this next paragraph somewhat talks about. So a farmer continues this way: that a national government will prevent the influence or danger of foreign intrigue or secure us from invasion is, in my judgment, directly the reverse of the truth. The only foreign, or at least evil foreign influence, must be obtained through corruption. Where the government is lodged in the body of the people, as in Switzerland, they can never be corrupted. For no prince or people can have resources enough to corrupt the majority of a nation. And if they could, the play is not worth the candle. The facility of corruption is increased in proportion as power tends by representation or delegation to a concentration in the hands of a few. I'm taking this now in the concentration in the hands of a few, the representation or delegation, actually putting together something for a friend and a colleague here in Ohio, Tom Zauskowski, who has been very influential in the Tea Party movement in Ohio and elsewhere. And one of the areas that we were talking about was that of representation. Are we truly represented? So not to belabor that, but I'm getting that to him. It's very, very interesting in what the founders intended on representation and where we are today. But the last statement here, to concentrate in the hands of a few. So the power right now is in the hands of a few. So the facility of corruption is increased in proportion as power tends or increases by representation or delegation into that concentration into the hands of the few. And that's what we have. The fact that we have few representatives for the number of population is a travesty in our nation right now. And that is a big play in the national intrigue, if you will, or as we talk about here, the foreign intrigue. And definitely, as we're seeing, we're not being secured from invasion, especially in our southern border, as well as elsewhere. So what we know is that this plays out, and that only foreign or at least foreign evil influences, the evil influence of the foreigner comes through that corruption. We're seeing as more is coming out that not only the Biden family, but those around them, as well as many Republicans, if you will, if you start doing your homework there, have had influence or are being influenced because of corruption. There's just the nature of mankind, right? The nature of man. And then when we take and we look at it, we come to that nature being that which is not what our founding fathers really talked about. Two things as we look at that internal piece, and then as I move into the ideas of commerce, business, technology, what does that mean? So for the first instance, I want to follow up with this with something that Sam Adams was talking about, and he was writing to John Adams in regards to, in this particular paragraph, the society of what they called Cincinnati. So these were all the different officers that served during the Revolutionary War, formed a society, a big club, something like, even like, I guess to the extent the Masons. They have been known in modern times as one of the, what do you call it? I guess the secret societies, whereas that was not their original intent. But to that, Sam Adams is writing to John in particular and talking about how you have to be watchful, even with George Washington having been a part or member of this, gaining all these honors through the Cincinnati gentlemen. And what he writes in particular here is that he says, but there is a degree of watchfulness over all men possessed of power or influence, upon which the liberties of mankind much depend. It is necessary to guard against the infirmities of the best as well as the wicked of the worst of men. Such is the weakness of human nature, that tyranny has often sprang from that than any other source. And what he's talking about is even from the good guys, tyranny comes from them because the expectation is they're going to do the right thing, and yet they don't. So he goes on to say to that, it is this that unravels the mysteries of millions being enslaved by a few. There again, that few always comes back to the few. What was it that induced the Cincinnati gentlemen who have undertaken to deliberate and act upon matters which may essentially concern, and he puts in quotes, the happiness and future dignity of the American empire, end quote. So there's a question there. What are these guys doing? At that time, there was some intrigue. There were some things that were going on in the background with all these former military officers. And here's what it was. To admit foreign military subjects, so foreign military person, into the organization, into their society. It was a question. What was going on with that? Was there not danger before that a foreign influence might prevail in America? Do not foreigners wish to have weight in our councils? Can such a junction of subjects of different nations, and those nations widely differ in their principles of government, to deliberate upon things which relate to the union and national honor, the happiness and future dignity of one, consist with sound policy? Same question we're asking today. What does that mean? Are we sure that those foreign nations will never have separate views and very national and interest ones too? Because they once united in this same object, it was accidentally their mutual interest to fight side by side. If the Cincinnati had a right to erect themselves into an order for the national purposes of their institutions, had they a right to call in foreign aid for those purposes? It appears to me the impolitic, preposterous, and dangerous as it would be for the United States to invite and admit delegation from that foreign power into their Congress. Outlined, laid out very easily and simply what foreign influences could be. Poses a lot of questions. No different than now. And we have a lot of that. But let me take you to something very interesting. One, I just take 2 minutes on, is that there's references here for you to follow up on, and this is that the CIA courting Silicon Valley. So when we go back to 2000, the CIA actually bankrolled in 2000 a high-tech startup fund. Isn't that interesting? It's called N-Q-Tel. It is a nonprofit that at that time in 2000 had $28 million. Congress approved for the CIA to start their own venture fund. And very interesting article. They went ahead in there. They reviewed over 300 business plans for 8 high-tech companies that they actually put seed money into. So when I talk about when did the Google schmoogles and a lot of these other companies, this was money that was actually put into a fund. But when you go back into the late 90s and start looking at technology back then, it's very interesting from the ventures. And then the DARPA programs, I've talked about that before. So why am I bringing this out about these influences? Well, this is that internal power influence, not even the foreign influences at this point, except for the fact that Gilman Loudy is the CEO of the CIA's venture group. Now, Gilman Loudy, he was a very interesting person in that he was influential from a national basis in high technology. I don't want to disparage or even sound like I'm disparaging people that come to the nation, U.S., or are born here from foreign nationalities. But when it goes back to what I said in the first segment, is that our founders intended that people be inculcated in who America is from our culture and our total belief system. Well, the fact of the matter is, many foreigners that went to the universities, I'm sorry, they were not inculcated in that because the universities and the perversions there. So to bring you onto this, I found, and it's on Wikipedia of all places, you take and you look on there, there is a whole section on categories for startups. And this whole chart goes back to, where I selected it between 1995 and 2005. And it goes through the various companies that were started up during that period of time. And in the subcategories, like technology companies established in 2000. The subcategories, there were 7 of them. Airbus was in 2000. There was no biotechnology companies that were really there. I mean, there were some. Computer companies established in 2000. Internet properties established in 2000. There was a podcast company that came about. They're very, very interesting. Software development companies, electronic companies, computer companies. So it goes through this whole list. And then there are 32 additional companies that started. Now, what I want to focus on with you just for this last couple of minutes in this segment is a company called Smartmatic. Smartmatic, as you well know, has been involved in the major controversies of right now with all the voting machines. Interesting history around that. Now, when you dig deeper on Smartmatics, is that they started in 1997. And it was 3 engineers that collaborated in putting together this company, and they are Venezuelan. The company is a Venezuelan company initially, but then it came together in the United States. And it was actually started to deal with smart cities, all that technology around all the eco-freak stuff. But then when they saw what happened in 2000 around the United States presidential election and the hanging Chad controversy, that's when they decided to dedicate their technology to electoral functions. And it was officially incorporated on 11 April 2000 in Delaware. A Venezuelan company that incorporated in Delaware and changed their focus, and it's going to be important as I talk a little bit about it in the third segment, from smart cities to now dealing with elections. Sam Adams fully believed that elections should have been 1 vote per person eligible to vote. And that vote should be given in secret ballot. And preferably, especially at that time, it was a written ballot. It was not electronic. So let's think about that for a moment regarding the smart cities as Sam Adams comes back in the third segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they did. They got it right. This is Tom Navolis, your host. And just to pick up quickly on a couple items from the last segment. So here's a teaser for all of you in the other markets that only get the first and third segment, is that the majority of those startup companies that I was referring to, and there's a lot that had started up, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s in the technology sector, no different than Smartmatics, all have some foreigners involved. So when the founders were looking at, and as we were talking about in the opening segment, the Anti-Federalists commenting a lot about commerce and foreign influence, as I talk about there in the blog post itself at samueladamsreturns.net. In those quotes, you'll see that the foreign commerce, also we look at foreign intrigue, the foreign affairs, and then George Washington talking about not getting involved in foreign entanglements. Wow. All of that was thrown out by the time you get to James Madison as president. It seems like the entanglements were so much there. And then as we move through, also then further into the years of the growth of the United States, how much foreign entanglements did we continue to have? And then as we moved into the 20th century, it became extremely gross when we started looking at the early part of the 20th century, World War I, then the mid part, World War II, and so on. Coming back just a moment on that and the technology aspect of it, the majority of these people, having been in the high-tech sector, having worked with venture capitalists, having been involved in looking at and doing due diligence on high technology companies, and having been either on a board or the advisory boards of a number of these different startups myself, I will tell you that the majority of the people in these startup environments are those of foreign origin. And I can quite tell you from my personal experience, although wonderful individuals for the most part, their ideas were their technologies and making money. They had no interest whatsoever in the fundamentals of liberty. No idea of the foundational truths necessary to maintain the foundational morality of the nation. So when I look at the additional foreign influences that have come into this nation, you just go back and look at the businesses and look at the fears of the founders and the concerns, even in foreign commerce, not only the intrigues of the depth of what would happen on direct foreign influence. Commerce was a big deal. And when we start looking at that, there are the whole idea of the economic aspects of it. You can go to the blog post itself and you can read for yourself the details here that I have from John Francis Mercer. He was a Maryland farmer, and he discusses the eventuality of the three classes of citizenry and predicts that all that's going to end up with are these two political parties in America. Here's his assessment on including the foreign mercantile interference, if you will, what I'm talking about. And it's what we're seeing so much. We even have these Chinese companies that are here in America. And when we look at the depth to that power influence in all of those lobbyists that are there in Washington, D.C., it's interesting, very interesting. Intrigue. It is absolutely intrigue. But here's what Mercer writes. He says here, the first class comprehends all those men of fortune and reputation who stepped forward in the late Revolution, from opposition to the administration rather than the government of Great Britain. So right there, you had men of fortune and reputation who weren't necessarily against the government, but they were against the way that it was being administered in the Americas. All those aristocrats whose pride disdains equal law, many men of very large fortune who entertain real or imaginary fears for the security of property. So you have two things here, what we're seeing exactly today when we observe what is going on with all of those people of money influence. They disdain equal law, but they push it. Oh, we want equality. We want the socialism. We want this for everybody else. But their concerns are whether they're real fears or imaginary about their property. What is mine, and what is yours is mine. So that's one of their mantras, if you will. Maybe taking a little bit too much, but that's the fact. They don't mind tyranny, despotism, dictatorships, and all of that as long as they can have theirs. And in fact, they're the ones that are establishing it in so many different ways. That is tyranny and despotism, so that they can keep theirs. So here was something also interesting that Mercer brought out, and what we see especially in a cultural shift. The cultural changes were happening even back during this founding period of 1788 when the Constitution was coming into play. You have to understand that the Great Awakening was dropping off. Pastors, as I told you before, by the time that 1750 came around, were no longer being fully established in those foundational truths of biblical Reformation truth. So by the time you get to 1788, there's many already that are Unitarians, and it's just amazing. So here's what he says. Mercer continues about chasing Europe and the whole ideas of the continent. Those young men who have sacrificed their time and their talents to public service without any prospect of an adequate punctuality or honorary reward, so financial or an honorary reward, all your people of fashion and pleasure who are corrupted by the dissipation of the French, English, and American armies. So everything kind of went away. All the young men leave the military after the war, but yet these influence of the French, English, and even, what came out of, okay, they're all gone. And a love of European manners and luxury. So the military disperses, and yet everybody focuses on this idea of European manners and luxury. Europe was already perverted by the time we got to the middle 1700s. By the time we got to this portion of that, he continues, the public creditors of the continent whose interest has been heretofore sacrificed by their friends in order to retain their services on this occasion. So what he's trying to do is he's saying, oh boy, here we go, that we're looking at the creditors. How is that banking system working? What's going on there in Europe? And what had happened in relationship to that? He even continues with those young merchants. And this is all one continuous paragraph, but I'm throwing my little bit of commentary in there. A large majority of mercantile people, which is at present a very unformed and consequently dangerous interest, Our old native merchants have been almost universally ruined by the receipt of their debts in paper during the war and the payment in hard money of what they owed their British correspondents since peace. So what we see is no different than the destruction of COVID. The same mechanisms that were here is that all our family businesses, those old ideas of how business runs within the concepts of a moral nation are destroyed by war, are destroyed by the loans that are there, the debts in paper during the war, and then the payment of hard money. That was the assets, gold and silver. So he continues on to say this, is that those who are not bankrupts have generally retired and given place to a set of young men who, conducting themselves as rashly as ignorantly, have embarrassed their affairs and lay the blame on the government, and who are really unacquainted with the true mercantile interest of the country, which is perplexed from circumstances rather temporary than permanent. Well, I have to say that things have become more permanent. But what we have is all these young men, all these entrepreneurs that came in the time of the revolution, all these entrepreneurs who have come in high technology since the mid-90s, who become now millionaires and billionaires, who have taken and looked at their influences, and what do? To continue their operations or the embarrassment of the facts of what they cannot do, they blame the government. They blame the government. This is very interesting. And they are what? Unacquainted with the true mercantile interest of the country. They could care less about America as long as they can have theirs. Now on to the foreign merchants. He continues with this. The foreign merchants are generally not to be trusted with influence in our government. They are most of them birds of passage. Some perhaps British emissaries increasing and rejoicing in our political mistakes. And even those who have settled among us, there you go, settled among us with an intention to fix themselves and their posterity in our soil, have brought with them more foreign prejudices than wealth. Boy, we see that. Time must elapse before the mercantile interest will be so organized as to govern themselves, much less others, with propriety. This is what I'm talking about. All of the different foreigners, whether they came from India, Indonesia, China, wherever they came from, all the different nations, into the high-tech sector in particular, as well as into the banking sector, when you look at all the formations of these different companies that were international and national here that have foreign leadership names to them, look at Twitter. Look at a number of other companies. They have no interest in America, but what they do is they're rejoicing in any political mistakes. They want to influence our government, and as they develop themselves here, they have foreign prejudice, more foreign prejudice than wealth. So what they bring with them is their whole ideology, their morality, and that's what has influenced America over the last 100 years to bring us to this point. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take you through, there's a lot more there. I want you to go through and read, and if you at SamuelAdamsReturns.net. But one of the last statements is here, let us not Ye lovers of freedom, be rash and hasty. Perhaps the real evils we labor under do not arise from these systems. There may be other causes to which our misfortunes may be properly attributed. Read the American Constitution, and you will find our essential rights and privileges well guarded and secure. May not our manners be the source of our national evils. May not the attachment to foreign trade increase them. Come on back next week when Sam Adams takes and is right with those anti-federalists.